So welcome everybody to the meeting on debt in time of coronavirus, and over to our first speaker, Kate Bradley.
Thanks for coming, everyone. I wanted to start by saying, so many of you have known me before I was in this guise, but for the last 2 years, I've been working in a debt law firm, so a law firm focused on consumer credit. And in that time, it's been like a really steep learning curve about lots of stuff with it, which is really interesting with a Marxist lens about how the debt sector works in the UK and across the world, and lots of interesting stuff about sort of how moneylenders function in practice as well as in theory. So there's a lot of stuff that I've picked up from that and have tried to apply some kind of lens to, some sort of Marxist lens to. But I think it's a topic we don't talk about as much as we could, given that it is now has involved a huge restructuring of the economy over the last 40 years to be consumer debt focused. So it's something which I think we do talk about in terms of occasionally in terms of Thatcher and deregulation of the finance markets, but we could be paying a lot more attention to the opportunities that it affords us as campaigners and activists to try and challenge this model of capitalism in a more substantive way. But one of the things I wanted to say was debt as a concept has been very, very naturalized over the course of human history, to the point where David Graeber in his book Debt, the First 5,000 Years says that throughout human history most societies have agreed on two things. First, that it is wrong not to pay your debts, and secondly, that moneylenders are scum. So the fact that we can have these two seemingly conflicting sentences working as one tells us something about the nature of debt as something which is seen as a moral obligation, which is seen as something that you definitely owe, but which also creates a lot of anger and frustration amongst debtors, particularly about the way that the system works. So there are conflicting, contradictory urges in us there that I think can be exploited in campaign terms. So because it's so deeply structured into the economy, the state has various mechanisms for ensuring that debts are paid. So we've got the busy county court system, which spends every day of its life issuing CCJs, which are county court judgments forcing debtors to pay back if they haven't paid back their debts to moneylenders, as well as enforcement such as high court bailiffs who have the right to steal your stuff in exchange for the amount of money that you owe, and mortgage repossessions, obviously, where you've secured your debt against a house and you're no longer able to pay, so they take your house off you. So money lending is, for the most part, a well-oiled machine designed to circulate money through the economy, then suck it back up to the top over time with interest. So it intensifies the inequality between rich and poor, and between wealthy companies and debtors. Anyone resisting can find themselves in a spiral of debt and cut out of the means to repay it, because if you get to a certain level of indebtedness, you cannot take out any more, which can have dire consequences for people's life, right through from bankruptcy and IVAs, which prevent them doing a whole range of things in their life, even taking out store cards and living and buying a house and so on, right through to homelessness and extreme poverty. So it is a quiet coercion in our society that is going on every single day. Currently, thanks to Margaret Thatcher, the debt sector looks quite different to how it did 50 years ago. So it's huge to start with, and it has, the way Thatcher's deregulation actually played out was it ended up allowing to practice a whole range of firms and moneylenders who previously would have been regarded as loan sharks or working outside of the law. So right down from your high street banks who've always been allowed to lend, you get down to like subprime mortgage lenders who can lend to poorer people who maybe don't have the means to repay, lending much more unstable debt. Credit card lenders and store cards, which have proliferated. So there's thousands well, hundreds of different store cards and things you can get now, which do technically count as credit because you do owe the money back. Down to rent to own firms if you can't afford your own furniture. Companies like Bright House and Perfect Home, who end up charging up to 4 times the value of an item, of a household item, if your family can't afford to pay it. Right down to short payday loans and high-cost short-term credit is what it's officially called, for people who desperately need to get to the end of the month and can't, and guarantor loans, which at the end of the spiral, what I've learned since working in this debt law firm, is that the end of the spiral of debt is often a guarantor loan, because what a guarantor loan does is it says, if you can't repay it, someone else can. And so they're very free and easy with guarantor loans, because they'll always get a repayment from someone, even if they have to drag them through the courts. So guarantor loans, once you've built up hundreds of different, up to 50, 60 different bits of credit on your credit file, go for a guarantor loan and somebody else will end up having to cover the difficulties that you've had financially. So it's a horrible repeating pattern that I see as someone on the consumer side of debt law. So just to widen the picture out, the statistics from the Money Charity, which is really good if anyone wants to make a note. They do statistics every single year and have done since 2005 about the amount of debt in the economy. So people in the UK at the end of January 2020 owed £1,680 billion in debt, including mortgages. This is up by 48.7 billion from 2019. So that's the exponential rate at which debt's growing. The average debt per household, including mortgages, was £60,000, £60,363. That's including mortgages. Even excluding mortgages, but including student debt, it was around 15,000 or 15,400. And excluding student debt, it was around 8,000. So even if you go right down to just loans, credit cards, store cards, rent to own, you're still at £8,000 per household, which is an insane amount of debt if you think about what debt is, which I'll come on to. These are numbers which have continued to grow since the 2008 recession, after which consumer credit markets grew as wages stagnated. So people have often replaced their income with credit in order to keep up their lifestyle as their wages stagnated. So this is an economy even more volatile post 2008 than it was before it in terms of the role that debt plays. So this was the picture in the UK before coronavirus hit, but we have to ask what will happen now following the pandemic, because that's sort of why it's come back into focus. And I think to understand it, we do have to think a little bit about how debt works. So debt in a very apolitical way can be understood as borrowing money from the future. So it's the presumption, you're lent money on the presumption that your income will grow enough, or at least will stay the same for long enough for your creditor to reclaim that money with interest from you in the future. So in order to keep the trust and the value of packages of debt that are held by banks and moneylenders, the debtors have to generally be paying it back. So it's got some slack, you know, they can have some defaults before the trust in the system wanes, but fundamentally, enough people need to be paying that money back that there's assurance that that will continue. And it was that problem which triggered the 2008 global economic crash, as it became clear that large, primarily American banks, but also world banks, had been advancing mortgages to people who could never pay it back. So a landslide of defaulted mortgages in 2007 brought the system to a halt for a while because the trust went in those packages. You couldn't sell that debt on for love nor money. People had to pay you to take your debt off, to take the debt off them. So a lot of the banks went down, as we know, the Lehman Brothers in America, and it had enormous passed on consequences for ordinary people, from huge spike in mortgage repossessions right through to job losses, companies trying to cut their losses through sacking workers, and we know after that history unfolds as we remember it. So what I would argue with COVID-19 is that we're now facing a similar moment where lots and lots of people, as a result of not of the financial sector but of this virus, will be struggling to repay debts, and they won't be able to repay it at the rates that mirror the assumptions of the banks when it was lent, because anything which affects society on a huge level will have the potential consequence of creating a wave of defaults, not just a small number, but a wave that not only reduce the trust in that debt, but also reduce the profits of the banks and the moneylenders. So large numbers of people have lost their jobs, as we know, and there's been a 50% jump in firms going bust in April 2020. So a huge number of even firms who also owe debt, so will also be feeding into the system, won't be able to pay it. So I've already noticed 3 payday and high cost credit lenders go bust in the first few weeks of coronavirus. So Uncle Buck, which is one of the big payday lenders, and Bright House, which you stalwart of the high street in if any of you grew up in towns like mine, Walsall, they've gone bust. And it will change the landscape of lending for a little while, as companies are nervous to lend, as borrowers are nervous to borrow, and as companies go bust because they don't see the profit margin as being viable anymore. But But we do have to remember that it's not that big a deal, because these companies have always been hydras. You know, as soon as you cut off one head, one of their brands, you know, they will come back as soon as the market's right for them with a new name and a company registered in Malta. But yeah, so to try and deal with what the consequences of this might be for the lending markets, the FCA, which is the Financial Conduct Authority, have tried to issue some guidance. So the FCA were created in 2013, I think, as a slightly toothier version of what used to be the FSA, the Financial Services Authority. And basically the FSA were effectively a pointless regulator, because after Thatcher there was that long period where the money market spiraled and became huge. The FSA were basically encouraged politically to just keep their nose out of it. They weren't given that much power to regulate finance companies. And after the 2008 crash, the FCA were created to try and to take over from them and to have a few more teeth. So every year the FCA do issue very large fines for mishandling of mis-selling of mortgages, for bad credit practices, but they are fundamentally on the side of the lender. They're just slightly toothier to try and keep the system running as normal rather than boom and bust. So they're a little more powerful, but not really. But an example of them being very weak has been how they've reacted to COVID-19. So they have announced that any client in difficulty, so any individual consumers in difficulty, should receive a temporary payment freeze. So in the case of mortgages, this has been described as a payment holiday. But in the case of other credit, it's called a payment freeze, and it's where they essentially freeze interest and charges on your accounts for a few months as a way of giving you some respite to get your finances in order. However, to cause as little disruption as possible, they've left the onus on the consumer to approach their lenders. So the debtors have the responsibility of asking for that forbearance. So if you don't know it's there and there's no special reason to, it's not been widely publicised, or if your lender decides not to play ball and they don't yet know what enforcement against them is going to be like, so they just go, no, actually, we don't think you do deserve forbearance, then things can just carry on as normal. Also, it's worth saying that the difference between a freeze on your payments and a reduction in your payments is huge, because what it means is that all the onus of the debt people can't pay over the next period because of coronavirus will be carried into their future on the assumption everything gets back to normal in a few months' time, which we don't know. They've only offered a 3-month freeze. We don't know if that's going to help. And we also, for me, it seems much more like that the aim is not to really help consumers, as you'd expect. It's to defer the wave of enforcement action that they have to take against debtors. So right now, if they started trying to issue repossession claims, county court judgments, collection processes for thousands and thousands and thousands of people at the same time, it would be almost impossible for them to administrate. But if they can delay it by giving a few people forbearance and kick it down the road, they can deal with it. It's a little bit like the flatten the curve approach, but for debt collecting. So this situation is currently, there has been nothing offered to people in serious debt, or even just people in a bit of debt, to get them out of that situation in future. And the government has offered a shocking solution, which is, why don't you take out more debt? So the Tories' wider solution to the credit crunch is actually to encourage more borrowing, both for businesses and consumers. So there's a whole page on the government website that you can look at, if you like, on government-backed loans. So these are the loans they're offering to small businesses, where, believe it or not, this would be an absolutely, if they weren't so ideologically bloody-mindedly Thatcherite, this would be a perfect moment for them to offer the loans and gain all the interest. Not that I like that idea, but you'd think that would be the logical thing for them to do. But instead of which, they are just guaranteeing other lenders loans. So they're trying to encourage banks and money lenders to lend out to large numbers by saying that they'll pay up to 80% of the loan if the business can't, or the consumer. So yeah, the business specifically can't. This is to try and increase the stability of that lending and to try and encourage banks to actually bother, rather than just sitting on their reserves like they did in 2009 and 10. However, there isn't any information that I could find on whether who'll have to pay it back if they guarantee it. So will they charge the individuals and the businesses who haven't been able to pay it back afterwards to try and get that 80% guarantee back? I don't know. I don't know about that. But either way, this is what they've offered. This is what they've suggested. They've encouraged people to go out, businesses and consumers, and get more loans. And or it seems to be kind of a flogging a dead horse approach to debt, where we can see that every single time now there's any kind of crisis, there's a massive economic credit crunch, because of the fact that debt is based on a future in which there is a presumed utopian growth, and everyone can afford to pay that money back. And although it can work even when it's not quite on track, it's really obvious that if we keep adding debt into that pile, which gets harder and harder to envision ever being able to repay, not paired with any growth across the rest of the economy over a long period of time, then even their own scheme will backfire on them. And obviously, as Marxists, we don't especially care about the health of the debt collectors, but this boom and bust mentality has not in any way been addressed after the financial crash. And even in the way that George Osborne, as during the government after the economic crash, dealt with it, was to just try and create another credit bubble of mortgages, and to restore house prices. So they haven't got an approach, is what I'm saying, to a proper economic approach to trying to resolve crises, even on their own terms. And this will come back to bite them, I think, but most of all, they'll make it come back to bite us. So finally, I wanted to think actually about opportunities in this, following this picture, because there is a huge capacity for refusal to pay debt in all of this, because one of our key aims, I guess, following this crisis will be to try and make them pay for it, not us. Make the debt collectors, the money lenders, the government pay for the crisis and shoulder the burden of that crisis, rather than placing it back onto individuals when the mortgage repossessions start again and the credit gets kicks off again. So how we do that is open to a lot of questions. I haven't been able to find a huge number of activist groups or campaign groups that do stuff around debt primarily in the UK, but I have found there's a group called Debt Resistance UK, who I'm probably going to reach out to following this to ask them what they're up to, because they seem to have quite a radical approach to debt, and I'd like to see what they do. Another project that I saw a few months ago that I really liked the look of was, albeit I don't know if it would scale, but it was a project where a group of people occupied a former cooperative bank, and they fundraised to buy up loads of debt in the local area. And debt collectors can pay as little as 4 pence in the pound for every bit of bad debt that they buy. Try to explain that the banks can only bother with a certain amount of enforcement before it becomes just too expensive and too boring to chase people around for money they're not going to pay. So after a few years, they often sell the debts for a fraction of the price, and then another company makes it their mission to extract that money from that consumer by hook or by crook, by intimidation or harassment, and get that money out of them. And they can pay, as I say, as little as 4 pence in the pound. And their profit margin is then anything more than 4 pence in the pound they get back is profit to them. Costs aside. But what this little group did was they bought up loads of debt in Walthamstow. This was a couple of years ago, in Walthamstow in London. They bought up, I think, £1 million worth of debt with £40,000 of fundraising. And they wrote it off. They cancelled it. Because you can just do that with debt. If you are the legal owner of the debt, you can decide not to chase it. That's fine. So at that point, they just wrote to everyone and said, "You don't have any debt anymore on this loan. Have a nice week." And the potential of that, I don't know how scalable it is, but I really like debt cancellation, albeit it doesn't do a particularly vital it could just be seen as propping up the health of capitalism because it just takes some bad debt out of the system. But the real effects on the lives of those people who had £1 million worth of debt between them, that they couldn't pay, that might have ended up in a CCJ, it might have ended up in lots of trauma and difficulty in repaying, but also which was very likely to end up, because they were selling that debt, that means that it was going straight into the hands of a debt collector. So that is one example of something that I think is good. Debt Resistance UK is there. I'd be interested to hear if anyone else knows of anything out there or can think of any kind of projects. I suppose things like mortgage strikes, which we don't think of as much as rent strikes, and stuff could be worth thinking about. And so if anyone's got any ideas or anything, that would be really appreciated.
And thanks very much. That's got us off to a good start. Next, we've got Seb, who's going to speak for a little while, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Okay, so I'm going to talk more about the sort of the government debt response. Kate's obviously mentioned that a little bit in terms of guaranteeing the lending of other financial institutions. I'm just going to talk more about sort of the size and what I feel is the wider macroeconomic impact of that, as well as a little bit of discussion around how sort of that's likely to change consciousness and what sort of activism we might be able to build from that change. So here in the UK, we've seen sort of 3 changes in our economic focus in response to COVID-19. So it's first of all, incredible pressure on health resources, unsurprisingly, as actually people get sick and need to be treated. And so we've seen all the various unfortunate death tolls and need for ICU beds and things like that. And then alongside that, we've had significant shutdowns in sort of the non-essential economic activity as a reaction to that, the pandemic, and then also government action shutting down to try and reduce the effect of the pandemic. So people have gotten scared of, going into crowded areas, and then there's actual, now state enforcement saying people cannot congregate together. And while those two are happening, we've also had large-scale government intervention to try and maintain the overall economic structures in the UK. So it's ramping up health service provision, shutting down other parts of the economy, but they're doing that in a way that reduces sort of the actual output and consumption of the economy rather than reducing the capacity. So it's furloughing people, it's offering loans, it's grants on occasion, rather than just letting businesses collapse and unemployment explode like you see in places like the USA. So yeah, the way the government has done this is to protect asset prices and inject liquidity into the system. So it's broadly a strategy of getting loans to everything that moves and the government buying everything that doesn't move through quantitative easing programs. And so that's an attempt to sort of give stability at the business level rather than any individual, actual economic activity level. So that's why you see things like, to take the USA as an example as well, they have like one of the best weeks growth of the stock market ever, while reporting the highest unemployment levels ever, because they are completely separated in terms of what it actually means now. The real economy is pretty much completely divorced from the financial economy, based on the USA's Federal Reserve promise to just buy everything and lend money as much as necessary to the large companies that make up the stock exchange, basically. Here in the UK, we haven't followed that scheme, that strategy, because we've also introduced furloughing, which is part of reducing output and consumption. It's just, rather than firing people, they go on furlough. And based on some statistics from the ONS I saw the other week, that's worked extremely well. Potentially 1 in 5 workers have been furloughed, and only 1 in 100 have been made redundant over an examined period, just at the beginning of, at the end of last month. So if that's a strategy to actually maintain employment relations, then it's worked very well so far. In addition to that, we've also had a massive loans program. Kate's mentioned a little bit about that. The amount is actually up to 350 billion, which is 15% of GDP, and the government is sort of, yeah, using that as the guarantee lent through existing financial structures, but then is also suggesting that that money will be raised through the private lending market. So it's a strange situation where they're sort of promising to sell bonds to the institutions that then also offer loans, and so they're able to almost generate, the financial institutions are generating cash on both ends at this point, because they're offering loans that are then protected, and then on the cases that they aren't protected, they're being funded by bonds that they can also buy, possibly at a positive return. So a lot of the structuring is essentially just continuing the worst mistakes of the 2008 and sort of general corrupt and complicit governments, where all the money continuously gets financed to the financial institutions at the heart of it. So there's actually also another arrangement between the government and the Bank of England, where the government can borrow £200 billion directly from the Bank of England without having to use the private markets. So it's interesting that there's such a different, well, there's the two methods of doing it, and there simply is no objective reason to rely on the private markets except for ideological, or those actual transfers of money to the financial institutions themselves is another way of backing it up. But even then, that seems to be insufficient, and so the government is going to borrow from itself directly, basically. The impact of this, assuming all of that money gets lent out, is that government debt to GDP will increase by about 20%, and that will probably put us above 100% of GDP, pretty much guaranteed if we actually see a recession over the next few months, which I suspect we will. So those that were around for 2008, involved in all the arguments then, will obviously be well aware that when people get worried about debt to GDP levels, they start banging the austerity drum, and I strongly suspect that will be the outcome from this as well. That those sections of the of the political and economic realm that want to sort of get capitalism restarted, reopening the economy, will basically be shouting about the debt to GDP level very shortly, and will be trying to shut down as many of the lending programs as possible just to try and get the economy back to normal. But I suspect there will be no quick resolution to the lending schemes, and I'll quickly just explain why. The normal process of capitalism is exploitation of labor in the workplace, and then the realization of profit in the marketplace. So that continues for however long. Then there's a crisis when the value in the system is vastly outsized in relation to the amount of capital, that there's no longer any realization of the surplus value. Then you have the crisis. Large amounts of capital become devalued, firms collapse, etc. They are then bought out by the survivors at vastly reduced rates. So that reduces the amount of capital overall in the system, and the capital accumulation continues again. However, from 2008, the crisis was so large and so centered around the center of the economic system, the financial institutions and the banks and such, that the crisis wasn't allowed to resolve itself as normal. The too big to fail institutions probably should have failed if you wanted to kind of keep things going over in capitalism's normal way. But since that wasn't viable, given the nature of the economic structure and the political will at the time, instead what we had was quantitative easing, which is government purchasing of assets directly to maintain their value, lowering of interest rates, and then massive government loan offerings and bailouts. So similar to what we've just seen, really. And the result of that in 2008 was that debt became incredibly cheap, so long as you had some kind of access to this government provision, or you didn't have to go through a whole bunch of financial intermediaries to get those very cheap loans. And so the result of that was that loads of businesses that broadly should have collapsed managed to survive on the cheapness of this debt. The term that's used for them is zombie firms, and they become sort of completely, they are undead in the sense that they shouldn't really be financially viable anymore. They exist because they can continually refinance their debts at such low rates that they don't collapse, but they're no longer making enough profit to be able to do any kind of reinvestment or productivity increases in their operations. So they're stuck at this level, not able to live fully within the capitalist accumulation framework, not really pushed into a position to die either. And so that's what's happened to a lot in the UK, which is why we've had such terrible growth rates and terrible productivity gains while maintaining high employment, because we've relied heavily on sort of labor intensive industries to continue existing. And there's been no kind of real investment in in capital and in capital intensivity. So the result of this is that we entered 2020 with a completely stagnant economy. We basically had no growth whatsoever in the last quarter of 2019. And, I think the growth was something just along the lines of £100 million or something, which was technically positive, but given the size of the economy was absolutely tiny. And so the only reason we essentially aren't in a recession right now is because of that tiniest increase in the last quarter. And instead we're going to go into a technical recession in the middle of the year, because it will be 2 quarters of consecutive shrinking of the economy. So, but the response to, well, that's independent of COVID-19. And then we had to have a response to COVID-19 as well as that. But the government had no space and no strategy to do anything differently. So we saw exactly the same thing: expansion of loans and lending, cutting of interest rates, and kind of hoping everything will hold over until we get to a kind of stage where we can actually just open up the economy again and things go back to how they were before. But that's just not particularly viable or realistic in terms of what's going on, because the lending is attempting to replace economic activity, as in actual income. Then it's completely different framework. Like Kate was talking about, it's just, even if these are very cheap loans, they aren't income. They are things that then do have to be paid back at a later period of time, and the firms become reliant on them. And so what's happened is that we've created a more series of zombies. Some industries and companies that never got access to these loans, or they were unable to get them at the terms that they required because the institutions themselves were setting their own criteria to begin with, such as very high collateral, meaning you need to put lots of money or property up front to guarantee the loan, and many businesses won't have done that. So holes have appeared in what the previous economic structures were, which is going to immediately disrupt any attempt to reorganize and open up supply chains and deliveries and all of that kind of stuff. And those firms that do exist have suddenly got to orientate more around repaying the debt that they've had to take on, rather than acting as they did before. So there's already been like a permanent reorganizing of the economy, that there can't just be a return to normal. It's already changed shape. Second of all, any kind of restart to the economy is going to be very fragmentary. It's not everywhere going to be opening up at once, and not in the same capacity as before. So certain US Treasury figures were suggesting that the COVID-19 recession will be V-shaped, where starts at a level, goes down, and then returns to a previous level, like that of a tourist economy during the off-season. Just as soon as it's on season again, it pretty much picks up everything as it was and carries on. But the act of using loans to try and maintain it, as I've said, is imperfect, and it distorts what's going on. So there just is not going to be that same structures to rely on the supply side. And also on the demand side, as well as sudden businesses not being able to exist or act in the way they did before, the final consumer demand will be very different, because the various entertainment industries that rely on people in close proximity, people will not want to be sitting next to each other in cinemas very soon. Restaurants that reopen might have, restrictions on one person to a table. So suddenly group dining is no longer achievable, even though the restaurants are open. So there's going to be continuous reductions in demand, major disruptions in supply, and it's just not a simple reopening, things get back to normal. So restarting the economy is going to be a piecemeal, difficult process of re-establishing the severed connections within capitalism, which is only going to increase the difficulties that any firm exists. So what you are going to see is stuff starting to open, realizing it's unviable and collapsing again. So the idea that suddenly the lifelines that government's already extended through loans and support and grants, etc., will ever be able to be just stopped doesn't seem particularly realistic to me, because it's now a fundamental part of the economic structure. And you either cut it all off and everything falls apart, or you have to keep maintaining it. So the question of, sort of the debt that the government is going to be responsible for, and how to handle that becomes a really important question. Because ultimately, the failure to resolve 2018 and the failure to come up with any good way of handling debt apart from austerity means that the current situation we're in, they've tried the same techniques to keep things going. They don't have any better answers than they did last time. And so that we're quite likely to end up in, a strong argument being called for austerity, or the argument will be between, well, we just continue with the massive cycles of debt, the rising inequality, because the debt is still focused on protecting asset prices rather than any kind of worker protection or productivity increases. Or we do a return to austerity, which means, well, we continue offering these loans and things like that to protect that part of the economy, but we reduce everything else that the state does to try and lessen the debt. Or they just say, well, if you don't want to do either of those, let's just let the whole damn economy collapse. And so what we need to be doing now broadly is trying to think a way out of that framework, some way that we can coherently argue for an economic perspective that's not reliant on just paying the debt down or maintaining the loans going. And so it's time to start thinking about alternative economic structures that can be, well, people will relate to under the current situations, think are better than those alternatives being presented by, the government and other political forces as their options, and then what actual organizations and things that currently exist that we can operate with. Because currently there's a lot of contradictory feelings amongst people about just society in general. So there's fear and uncertainty about the present, about the future, about other people, but also a massive explosion of voluntary aid groups, volunteering for all kinds of sections like that, and a sense of support and giving, just unconditionally in many ways. And there's isolation and separation for many, either home working or because health conditions require them to self-isolate, or they're literally suspected of having COVID-19, and so there's periods of time where they just are meant not to go out and do anything. But then also great public expressions of solidarity for the NHS and key workers. So that's just a real way of connecting, and then other proliferation ways of connecting like we're doing now with the online meetings and things like that. There's, sort of government and corporate orders about how and where we can work, where and how we can go out in public and exist with one another. And yet also successful public pressure campaigns continue to exist, for instance, against Weatherspoons. There's other pressure in workplaces about social distancing and protection. There are still ways of succeeding and fighting in the current environment. So the working class has basically found itself both pushed apart and holding itself together. And so that spirit of being able to hold ourselves together is what we should be probably trying to think of and work through into the future. So in conclusion of sort of what we can actually try and organize to do, and how making what people's experiences are during the pandemic into actual, solidarity and left-wing action, is there's many different ones, but I'll focus just on sort of the debt angles today. That, as I was just saying, that a lot of people are now experiencing direct interactions with debt and sort of debt-free forms of perpetuating existence or production and reproduction of their everyday life. And, you know, between furloughs, rent arrears, government loans, quantitative easing, volunteering groups, mutual aid groups, having to go on universal credit or other benefits for the first time, and of course the expansion of personal debt to cover whatever obligations people might be having over the period, they're suddenly thrust into a world of debt and debt-free kind of provision that people are suddenly starting to think about and organize with. So you can have well-organized systems of support that don't come.
Just to let you know, you've been going 20 minutes now.
Yeah, I'm literally coming to the wrapping up. Yeah. So people are starting to experience actual, you know, organized groups that achieve their results, deliver effectively, without having, you know, top-down authoritative bosses ordering them or heavy price tags for the future. It's literally just organizing together for protection and help. So things that can be maybe argued for and campaigns built around in the future is going to be sort of the decommodification and opening up of social spaces and activities during this period of recovery. So private parks and green spaces, for instance, there may well be, you know, very popular places for people to try and visit. And we should also think about ways of trying to take them into community ownership so that there is actual continued guaranteed access and people have a sense of control and ownership over them. Communal eating establishments like the National Food Service is trying to launch, it will also be quite important because the entertainment and the sort of, you know, eating out environments are likely to be absolutely hammered by this, and they'll be swept away by corporate chains unless there is sort of active campaigns of resistance locally able to keep them going. You know, so previously communities have bought their local pub to keep it running, and so that sort of model might well need to be pushed out into vastly more spheres. There's also discussion around universal basic income. Like I said, many people are now being furloughed, which they interpret as the government paying their wages. And so the idea of there being greater levels of provision for everyone in society is no longer such an outlandish possibility. This can move beyond simple cash transfers because councils were given an order to end rough sleeping and they did it. So it was always a matter of prioritization rather than like a physical limits. And finally, just as sort of big picture thinking to bring it back to debt, like I'm really pleased that Kate brought up sort of debt cancellation as well, because I think the idea that of a universal debt jubilee, which is simply just total forgiveness, total cancellation of all debts, is not an outlandish proposition anymore, because so many people will have basically had to take on burdensome amounts. They'll be going into rent arrears. There'll be just all kinds of major debt burdens that they're aware of, that the idea of just suddenly flushing it all out of the system, wiping it all away, becomes an idea that gained traction among large numbers of people. And this does have wider, really quite significant possibilities as well, if we also extend that to third world debt and things like that as well. Because if we are forgiving all IMF loans, for instance, then that brings up questions of how do we want to reorganize the global trading economy as well, rather than just having it based around these systems of debt, which we've just declared to be like no longer sustainable. So I think there's a lot of discussions around ownership and obligation and debt that we can really develop in this period of time, and hopefully really take forward for some victories in the left. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Seb. So that's two really wide-ranging introductions to kick the discussion off. So I'll take Lou first.
Okay, cheers, Ian, and thanks, Kate and Seb, for that. It's very, very useful stuff. I'm not going to speak for very long. I mean, it's more a question, more a point of kind of saying what we can actually do in the here and now, which Seb did kind of start to address towards the end of all that there. Because I mean, I'm not used to organising a kind of protest using online. I mean, I've signed petitions and all this, something like many people have, but it's kind of, it doesn't have quite the same impact as getting a, you know, sort of like a few tens of thousands of people out on the street. But fair enough, you know, I'm very interested in Seb's idea about the general debt cancellation, although I suspect there might need to be a little bit more than just a kind of online thing, because that really would actually strike an arrow right at the very heart of the system itself, which I think would possibly up the stakes in terms of the response of the ruling class and the government and the banks, etc., on this sort of thing. But really, that's my sort of thing about what we can do in the here and now. I mean, on a practical scale, I mean, my son is one of these 1% of people who's basically been sacked because he was working for an agency. He had the temerity to ask if he could actually take some of the holiday that was owing to him, and they basically just terminated his contract because that's what they could do and this sort of thing. So I know him and all of his housemates are now in Bristol. They're all okay, but they're obviously, most of them are now on universal credit, which is taking 5-6 weeks to come through, which means that they have got issues. I mean, most of them have been working, so they're not perhaps in quite such a dire situation as many sort of people in this country will be. If they don't have any kind of reserves, but those reserves, as I'm sure we all know, if you've got a few £100, they don't last you very long if you've got fuck all coming in. So there is that kind of thing there. So I mean, the thing about debt cancellation, the thing in Walthamstow, I mean, that does seem like kind of a great thing. But then I was sitting there thinking, it's a great idea, but you've still got to have the 40 grand to do that in the first place. And I think, it's kind of like, I mean, it's getting a hold of that kind of money might well be a bit of an issue. Nonetheless, let's take everything on as kind of as potential strategies. But really, I just wanted to. The last thing I wanted to sort of raise was, I mean, because I am fucking old and I'm used to going out on the streets and shouting and possibly, but not really throwing bricks and this sort of thing. But basically, because that's the kind of thing that that I'm kind of used to. I mean, is it possible for us to kind of prepare stuff now using online sort of forums for a resurgence? I mean, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to be really pissed off. There's going to be a lot of people who are desperate. Okay, and could we use that as a focus? Is that too much in the future? I mean, I just don't know what other people think about it, because I mean, to me, that because of my history and all this kind of thing, that seems to me is something that we could definitely do. Because at the end of the day, if you're going to challenge the very base of the system, then I think you have to then say, well, okay, how are we going to force them to do that? And that's the question I just really think I'm going to put on. Okay, cheers.
Thanks, Lou. Sam has just posted something in the chat box I can see, saying about debt and the EU, debt versus grants, austerity, etc. There's a piece on Michael Roberts' blog that he's just shared the link to there. So who'd like to come in next? Fergal?
I thought that was very good, comrades. All really useful kind of stuff as well, which is great, because I know you get to so many of these meetings where it's just talking about the problem, but not like what we can actually do or whatever. And I really like the idea of, I'm kind of like with the small scale debt cancellation, like I like it because, I mean, I've got two minds about it. Like on the one hand, it's like drop in the ocean kind of stuff. And then, how do we get that much money and whatever. But like you said, Kate, like you're actually affecting people's lives right now. And if you can do something like that and make it clear the politics of why you're doing that, like, like say I can't remember the figures, but like say you get $4,000 or £4,000, sorry, and you cancel X amount of debt, like, and if you politicize that, it makes it very clear, what I mean? Like, as long as it makes it very clear that it's not just, oh, we're nice people, but this is the kind of, you bring people along with your politics. So I really like that kind of stuff. And I especially like the idea of making a debt jubilee kind of thing, like raising that, because then it kind of makes it this really great big whole thing that, it's like making a whole political statement about the whole system and structure and the way it's set up and who is going to pay. Because, I mean, I guess one thing I was thinking of is I can almost see the government bailing out predatory lending of all this kind of stuff, and the banks and all that's going to be their approach is, oh no, the system's in crisis, we just need to give the banks more money to keep it going, and it'll just be like global financial crisis 2 kind of deal. But another thing I was going to say, but I've just lost it. Sorry, give me 10 seconds, and if I can't remember, I'll call it there. Financial crisis. Yeah, that's right. So just one thing that's been really like struck me in Australia is it's kind of like, so talking about universal credit and welfare and all this kind of stuff, the government's outmaneuvered a lot of the, especially the soft left. Like they've doubled the welfare payments, click their fingers, and now like for the coronavirus. On top of that, like for ages, the left in Australia had been saying we just want to raise it by say $75. The government's the Conservative government raised it by $75 a week. The Conservative government raised it by $250 a week. You know, work that out in pounds, but you get the numbers. And now the Conservative backbench are saying we want to keep that after the coronavirus. And so they've basically outmaneuvered the left in terms of what we've been asking for a long time. Like, and it's kind of embarrassing in a way, because it just goes to show, at least in the Australian case, like how much our imagination was limited. But doing something like this with the, you know, like, I think that's kind of the power of this debt jubilee demand, is that it becomes something so big that it, even if the government does realize, okay, shit, that's what we have to, at least it's something that we kind of, it was within our imagination. It's not something where it's kind of like, wow, the Conservatives have kind of pulled one over us and, you know, made us kind of look, not, kind of just, I don't know, to put themselves like they're the caring ones. I think it's really important that we make sure we're asking for more than what they're going to give. Otherwise, I don't know, it's just, makes them look kinder than what they are.
Thanks, Fergal. Pete, I can see he's got his hand up.
Yeah, thanks to both the speakers. I guess I've got a couple of questions which relate to kind of understanding the circumstances in which we organise. I'm really interested perhaps in the way that, you know, the very large numbers of debt that already existed are kind of distributed across the population, because I think that has an impact on kind of who's indebted and how they experience it and how we might organise. But also, I wonder whether we need to look more closely at, I think maybe Seb put a kind of a bit of a gloss on the impact of furlough, which I'm not sure about, I mean, in terms of the proportion of people that have actually got it. But the one thing I am sure about is that the impact of that is pretty uneven. So here in Scotland, in the oil sector, for example, there's a beginning of mass layoffs in the North Sea. Mostly people are being just made redundant, and the companies are saying it's force majeure. You know, it was a virus, there's nothing they could do about it, so you're gone. No, many of those people though were on short-term contracts as well, so they basically, the issue is with the agency rather than with the company, and there again they're just getting made straight redundant. And then in Edinburgh, where I live, the other area where people are not getting jobs is something like tourism, which was a huge part of the economy in the city. So, you know, it's kind of unevenly distributed across sectors and across geography as well. And I mean, the final thing I think is that clearly universal credit is expanding in a major kind of way, but for most people it's taking quite a long time. You know, that's been commented on. But the other issue is that if you get some money to tide you over while you're waiting for the universal credit to click in, that then just gets deducted, as far as I understand it, from your payments once they start being regular payments. And basically, since universal credit was not really enough to live on in the first place, by the time you got deductions from it, people are in a really bad state. So that means then that they're either, as is happening in, you know, parts of the city that I'm aware of, you know, people are going hungry in a big way, but actually, people can't live. So it's some questions that I think kind of we need to kind of bottom out to understand the circumstances in which we're organising.
Thanks, Pete. I can see Farah's typed a comment in the chat box. Do you want to speak, Farah?
Hi, yeah. So I just could not agree more with Fergal's comments. So it's been the same here. The Conservative Party have been at least saying that they're going to help more, and they're giving people money, and they've housed homeless even though they haven't. So what they say might be different than what they've actually done. But I do think yeah, our asks are too small if we're only looking at small personal debt, even though that's the start, and that's definitely something that we should all do. But I also think we should consider the global system works in that way, it works via debt. So I think it's about time that gets dismantled. So.
Thanks, Farah. Sarah has got a hand up. Do you want to come in, Sarah? Are you able to unmute yourself? I can.
Yeah, sorry. Hi, also from Edinburgh, from around the corner from Pete. And I wanted to make 3 points, really. Well, just to follow up on Pete's, just to start off with on universal credit. I mean, there's absolutely no reason for the 5-week wait and for the government's insistence on that. It's absolutely appalling. I used to run the Scottish Unemployed Workers Network, and it's something we've been campaigning against for ages. I mean, it has got slightly shorter, but it's still based on this idea that you have to be paid in arrears because that makes it more like real work. You know, it's just crazy when people are trying to survive. And it does get people into debt right at the beginning. And it's certainly to get rid of, it's such an easy thing to call for. I mean, yes, we should be calling for getting rid of the whole universal credit system and a replacement with a UBI. But as an intermediate thing, just to get rid of that 5 weeks and not call for what the TUC has got a call for, getting rid of the 5 weeks for the time of the coronavirus. Hang on a minute, you know, it's wrong anyway. We want it to stay gone. It's not just for people who are made redundant because of the virus, it's for everybody. Another couple of bigger points, that one of the things I think we should be calling for is that when government money goes into companies, that they're brought into public ownership. I don't think it's going to obviously happen with this government, but we should still be making the point. And I think the other thing that is really important to do now, whenever we can, is to actually help people to understand the nature of debt and the very different meanings of debt when it's government debt and quantitative easing, and that it's not the same as me getting into debt or you getting into debt, because we can't print money. And I think actually using this time to improve people's understanding of actually how the monetary system works is really important.
Thanks, Sarah. One of the things that's been sticking in my mind recently has been, I don't know if people remember the meme that was doing the rounds after 2008, and it was saying basically, if the whole world's in debt, who exactly is it in debt to? And that feels like it really fits at the moment, where you've got governments and lots of businesses and individuals all having this enormous debt. And you know, if it was kind of rational system, you'd think the people that we'd be in debt to would be the essential workers who are keeping everything going. You know, they're the ones actually producing this stuff that we're using at the moment, while most people aren't working. And I think that helps with the argument for debt write-offs, to be honest. The fact that the debts are actually, you know, primarily to financial institutions who are contributing absolutely nothing. But I wonder whether, alongside that kind of big demand, whether stuff around enforcement might be a kind of easier thing to focus on. Because obviously there has been the temporary ban on evictions that's in place. And we're likely to have a lot more people. I mean, somebody mentioned earlier about who has the debt, and obviously it's concentrated amongst certain groups of people. It's not, you know, that average isn't spread across the whole population. But a lot more people are getting into debt at the moment, including people who perhaps didn't expect to before this. So maybe that opens up the door to try and extend bans on debt recovery as a step towards forgiveness. I don't know. That didn't manage to provoke any more hands going up, which I was hoping it might. Who's next? Oh, Bev.
No, I just want to say thanks to the speakers for what they did. It gave that sort of really broad sort of coverage of it, because like Kate's coverage of the individual debt sort of angle, you know, and then she expanded it further, and then the sort of bigger aspect of it, I thought it was really good. I just feel it makes me, it's negative, but I also feel that it makes me think there's more positivity. There is more opportunity, perhaps is what I'm trying to say, to work at a grassroots level, as people have been saying. I mean, no one's mentioned about like rent strikes, and you just mentioned about resisting evictions, and there's a moratorium on that at the moment. But I think the fact that it's been highlighted that the system is going to be it's going to have lots of holes in it. It's going to be slow to recover, very slow to recover, and that so many more people are going to be affected than already the millennials have been, suffering a lot prior to this, because they can't get into the system, they can't afford to buy property, they can't get well-paid jobs. So because of the contradictions in the system, that's already been there, and that group of people, those sorts of people are going to be far more affected. I don't mean the millennials, I mean plus the other people which will be affected by being made redundant, by being furloughed and other things. So it's a much broader group of people. And I think that there is another thing about it, is that we're used to organising in terms of opposition to the bosses. And I'm not saying we're going to drop that, but it is about organising in opposition to financiers and to landlords. And then we have got a model for that, for example, from the climate change movement, through things like fossil-free campaigns against big corporations, because small businesses or smaller businesses are not going to be are going to be really impacted, but the massive corporations are not going to be. My understanding is that some of these big corporations, Amazon, Google, they're going to be just as well off, if not better, and they can at least basically protect themselves from what's happening through this coronavirus. So it is about organising in that direction. Yeah, so that's it.
Do Kate or Sab want to respond to anything that's been said? Kate?
Thank you, everyone. This is really great discussion. I've got a couple to come back to a few people. So something Pete said earlier about how debt is distributed across the class, or across classes and across sections of society. I think that's a really interesting question, because this is one of the reasons I think there's a real lack of left-wing organising in this sector, because everything you can find is like averages across the whole population, from charities that essentially don't have a class view of it at all. So the Money charity gives you loads of interesting information, but nothing to do with who this affects. It's just all averages. So I think, though, you can extrapolate something from, there will be stuff out there in niches I haven't found, but you can extrapolate something from from Thatcher's era, which is that actually in the past, debt was distributed differently to post-Thatcher because of deregulation of the finance market. So there's a book called Urban Warfare, which is about mortgage debt, where the author points out that the model of mortgage debt started with mainly middle class or at least like professional working class borrowers, because one of the ways you can ensure you're going to get paid back is by targeting your debt at your credit at a sector where most people will be in stable long-term jobs and have the money to pay you back. So for a long time, the stability of the market was based on the fact that you did not lend to subprime borrowers. And in America, this meant before about the 60s and 70s, Black people could not get access to credit across America because they'd been impoverished by the system of capitalism prior to that, and there was racism regarding their ability to repay and so on. So what the reforms of the 70s and the deregulation of the 70s in the US and in Britain and across the world did was to allow poorer borrowers into subprime borrowing on higher interest rates than other borrowers. So actually, the poorer you are and the worse your credit rating is, the more you pay in interest across all the economies. And that's just it's a given, it's an assumption of debt, which is completely arse backwards, but it is, because they're carrying the risk, they say, of lending to you, so they can charge you a higher interest rate. So Seb's managed to find some wealth quintile and debt, so that's useful. But yeah, it's worth bearing in mind that the massive expansion of the subprime market will have dragged poorer people into the credit economy around the world. In terms of just things to do, it's nice to hear from you, Farah, by the way. It's been a while. But I want to say, in terms of things we can do now, Bev mentioned rent strikes, but I actually think there might be more currency in a debt strike in this discussion, because rent strikes, you can get evicted. Debt strikes, you can get a CCJ. Lenders write off actually £5 million a day in debt. So bad debt, it isn't very healthy to the economy, and I can talk about this more if anyone wants me to, but I won't. But they write off £5 million a day in debt anyway. So a debt strike doesn't actually ask that much. If you just let your debt fall into the pool of bad debt, you think it might be the end of your life, but it might not be the end of your life, because there's so many precedents for it. Finally, sorry to go on, but demands to the government. I think several people have raised really interesting demands to the government. Ian raised enforcement. I think that could also be targeted at the FCA, who aren't used to getting any heat. So that would be interesting, because they have the power to do a lot more enforcement. For instance, fining companies that are continuing to chase debts and refuse forbearance, but they haven't been doing that so far. Sarah raised demands around universal credit, which I think is a really, really important. Cutting that waiting time would save a lot of people from poverty in the meantime, and would be a really good time to force that on them for after the pandemic finishes as well. And finally, the other thing I was thinking was, as moneylenders go bust, what usually happens to their debt packages, they sell them, is they get sold on and collected by other firms. If we could, for the period of coronavirus, say that if a firm goes bust, the debt gets written off, you'd wipe loads of debt from that system. As the businesses fell, it would reduce, and there might even be a prerogative in it for the government and for the FCA, which is that the companies that go bust first were often the ones doing the most mis-selling, because that's partly why they've gone bust, and they're often the ones who were selling to the poorest borrowers. So you'd be cleaning up the system to an extent, whilst helping a very large number of people, if you just broke with that trend of selling on the debts as assets rather than just wiping them. So anyway, those are my suggestions. I don't know how people think about those as demands or anything.
Thanks, Kate. I've got Sam and then Seb at the moment.
I was just going to ask a question just about the kind of the zombie capitalism aspect of it. So now what's happening is that states are standing behind banks, who are standing behind companies that would probably ordinarily they may or may not go bust, but on law of averages, some of them probably would have gone bust whether or not we had the coronavirus, and that's, you know, a far higher rate than you know, than you get in normal times, and it's probably not. I don't know if it's even going to be comparable to 2008-9. I'm just wondering to what extent people think that states themselves are at risk of becoming the zombies. You know, they're standing behind effectively a lot of companies that should otherwise go bust. I mean, I know through you know, if they can impose maximum austerity on us, then they might be able to recoup some of this. But yeah, in 2008-9, very few, well, I don't think any states actually went bust. But what do people think about that as a possibility this time, states defaulting?
Seb?
Yeah, I'll quickly come back right on Sam's question there. States and state financing is obviously very different from individual firm financing, because if you have access to your own printing press, then sort of going bust or running out of money is only possible if you decide to do that, or you need to pay back a lot of debt in currency that you don't control. So, like for instance, if we had a lot of debt in US dollars, we can't print dollars. So the US government, the UK government could go bust in that sense. Other than that, it's very much a question of sort of what are they willing to do and what consequences they're willing to bear. So for instance, the mass printing of money to pay debt would clear the debt, but then you'd have a lot more money in circulation, which may well have inflationary effects, for instance. And then there's all kinds of considerations around what does that do to the international balance of payments if it's very cheap to buy your money because there's lots of it and things like that. So I think, actual state default is very, very possible. I mean, Argentina's already in trouble again. There's many other countries that will be suffering under the actual weight of their debts and just the actual economic response to COVID-19 and stuff like that. So yeah, state default is definitely possible. I think might see some states dissolving depending on how bad they actually get hit by the pandemic and economic effects. I think that's entirely possible. But yeah, in general, it's a separate question from the zombie firms, because the actual requirements of them existing is different from an individual capitalist firm. They have different tools and different requirements on them. My sort of general comment coming back was going to be to try and just reflect a little bit more on sort of the moral obligations of debt, because Kate, when she was starting, was talking about there's the founding rules of society around debt in 5,000 years of history of debt. And I think I remember reading in that as well that sort of historically debt jubilees were almost a routine process, that they would happen around simple things like the crowning of a new monarch, or just every few decades they would take out the clay tablets that they used to store the debts and smash them. So it's not even buying them at cut rate prices. It was just literally a case of these debts are no longer considered valid. And that's like an important psychological thing, I think, to try and grasp and work with, because yes, like systems of obligation are how we build, sense of solidarity and community and support among one another. But the idea of seeing that entirely through debt is fictitious. It's an imposed sense of duty and obligation that obviously those that consider themselves above the rules or writing the rules don't have to obey. So like there's consequences for defaulting on your debt, but certainly corporations will walk away from all kinds of obligations whenever they feel like it. There's if we want to talk about rent strikes, one of the biggest rent strikers so far have been corporations themselves that are just flat out saying, well, we're not going to pay rent for our franchises this month. Because it's an obligation, which is fine, but we should be trying to use what's happening in society now to talk about different senses of obligation and different ways of doing it without relying on debt. So then we can move away from this debt-funded capitalist structure we've currently got, and then try and different ways of doing it. So that impacts on things like the universal credit one, but then also just on the idea that people have been compensating for the lack of income by taking on additional debt. So there's still obligations and we can make provisions for people, but then they don't need to be sustaining themselves through taking on debt. There's just a different way or a different timeline of ways that they will pay themselves back. And so it's articulating and structuring that way of thinking that we can try and break out from this frame of debt and then cancel debts or just replace the systems that were operating with it. And I mean, that's obviously a huge task. It's not something we can just theorize with. It will be around fighting over issues of debt that we establish alternative structures to that. But yeah, it's important.
One other aspect that I wanted to throw in is the relationship between debt and imperialism, because obviously institutions that are lending money and the financial markets are very concentrated in a few countries. They're not evenly spread around the world. And I was just reading Chris Bambury's Marxist History of the Second World War, and it was quite interesting reading about the part that international debts played in the build up towards that, with America, for example, insisting that debts could only be repaid in dollars, and Germany defaulting on them, and so on. And of course, we were already before this in a situation where the kind of power relationships between different major powers were shifting quite noticeably. But I could only assume that coronavirus will destabilise that even further, because some countries are going to be more financially hit than others, or hit in different ways to others. Will end up borrowing more or less than others, and so on. So I'd be interested to know what people think about the potential for it to create more imperialist conflict as well. Kate?
In terms of debt being repaid in certain currency and its relationship to colonialism, just quickly, I think it was a feature of, again, David Graeber talks about it, it's been a feature of colonialism, was to force local, the colonial, the occupied country or the occupied peoples to pay you back in your own currency, to force people into work. So it was more a method of forcing people into work for the colonial power. So he uses the example of Madagascar. So when the French went into Madagascar, they had real difficulty getting the peasants to do anything for them. They just kept their own harvests and tried to disengage. And that was one of the fight back methods, was just by not engaging with the French system. So they imposed a tax, which had to be repaid in francs. And at that point, you had to go and seek out work which could pay you francs, for fear of prosecution and persecution as a result of not paying. So debts being repaid in a particular country's currency has always been a feature of colonialism. But that also raises the question of how we end up indebted to the banks of our own system, because it's almost an accepted feature that's how you all work in the same currency. But one way of I don't know if people have researched or know much about credit unions. A lot of Muslim communities in Britain have a form of credit union as well, where essentially you draw your debts and you take your loans from a pooled fund from the community rather than from the major institutions of your country, as a way of charging much lower rates of interest and having much less unpleasant mechanisms of enforcement. It doesn't always work out that way, and a lot of credit unions do function basically like nicer banks, but it is worth looking into if you've got your savings in something that in a bank, that credit unions can offer you much better rates for credit if that's something you desperately need. Yeah, just thought I'd mention.
Okay, I've got Will next.
Yeah, you speaking about debt and imperialism just actually reminded me of, I wrote a review of it for the website, but if anyone hasn't read it already, What's Wrong with Right has some very good stuff on the international debt regime, and as an aspect of the international rights regime. And it's really interesting how basically loans, and where a lot of kind of IMF debt comes from, obviously is always conditional on economic restructuring. And it's, I suppose, what that tells us is not just that, debt plays an important role in anti-imperialist conflict in wars, but actually as well, debt is the vector through which imperialism operates. It is the means by which entire economies are restructured to suit the interests of more economically powerful nations, to restructure, to create commodities for the global market, etc.
Thanks, Will. Fergal?
I was just thinking it's a little bit tangent debt and imperialism, but kind of still in the same like I don't know, ballpark, whatever. It's like I just remember in uni learning a lot about microfinance or this kind of stuff in the global south where they lend money, you know, to a visitor so they can buy a goat and then or a bicycle, and then it means that they can. The whole idea is that they're encouraging, you know, small business or whatever, like empowering people to be self-sufficient through these small loans. But the whole deal is basically it's just money markets penetrating the global south into more and more minute ways, and you start learning about how they use all these, you know, it's just the same kind of like, you know, sexist, patriarchal, like kind of tropes to like guarantee that the money gets paid. And it just kind of gave me a thought of like how there's even the potential that that kind of stuff could end up being used. Like, I mean, I guess relating that to what happens in the global south, but coming back here, that lending money to people could be a way that they're going to, on the small scale of how, you know, that they're going to be the saviors of like kickstarting the economy and stuff like that, that if you lend money so they can go and buy a car or, you know, here, or so they can, I don't know, do whatever business venture, that kind of stuff. Like how, yeah, I don't know, maybe it's just something to think about, how that it's like, on the one hand, we want to be aggressive in cancelling debt, but being sure that the state doesn't try and use, you know, like debt as a form of charity, but not just to big business, but to us, like to the working class and this type of thing. And that it's like, you know, making sure that we're ready to say it's a false, that it's never charity, you know, that it's never a form of acceptable replacement for welfare or something like that. Over.
Lou.
Yeah, just very briefly, I was going to come back on something that one of the comrades was talking about big businesses right out and small businesses not. Because I mean, one of the things that has occurred to me over this time is, I mean, and as I'm sure many of you know, I do like my beers and you know, sort of mere proper ales and this kind of thing. But it does seem to me is that big concerns like say Fuller's or Green King or Interbrew or whatever it is, going to very easily going to be able to ride out this whole recession. But you look at kind of smaller places like, you know, I mean, I know it's a fairly minor point, but the smaller places like micro pubs, which are very big down on the south coast and are quite, you know, nice environments. You know, they're a little bit less similarly. They're probably going to be struggling enormously to come out of this at all. And I would assume also in the case of like, you know, things like restaurants, etc. It will be those local kind of restaurants, businesses that are going to be wiped out, whereas the big fuckers like McDonald's, you know, will just pardon my ways. I do swear too much for being recorded, really. But you know, people, you know, concerns like that obviously are going to be able to ride it out. So in some ways, they'll probably be looking at increasing their own market share coming out of this, and I think that's something perhaps that we can bear in mind, that we can do something around, kind of locally, whatever. Yeah.
Thanks, Lou. Anybody else before I get Kate and Seb to round things off? Kate, then, do you want to come back in, or?
I don't really have much to say, just to say this has been really interesting, and I think we've talked about a lot of stuff we haven't talked about before as RS21. So I suppose I'd encourage people to sort of go forward with thinking about this and what groups you might want to reach out to or link up with. Like I mentioned, Debt Resistance UK, I'm going to message them and just find out like what they're up to, if they're still going or anything, because I don't know. And also to extend that, to genuinely extend that, I think we should extend the conversation about if there's anything we can do as well as putting out demands. So do we want content on the RS21 website that starts militating for demands to popularise them a little bit amongst our people who read what we put out, and just start a conversation really that's more than just saying people are going to struggle to pay their debts, but it's actually going, right, well, what do we demand then, what do we want, who do we demand it to, and what can we do ourselves is maybe the next step. But yeah, so really strongly encourage people to keep thinking about it, because I'm sure debt affects more of us and our comrades, and as well as obviously it affects the wider class, but I'm sure it affects more of us than we even know, because it affects so many people in huge amounts of debt. So yeah.
Thanks, Kate. I've posted a couple of links in the chat box if people haven't seen them. There's stuff about if you want to join RS21, or message me if you want to go on the mailing list, message your email address, obviously, if you want to go on the mailing list. And also one of the innumerable links for the Day of Action on Tuesday, which is International Workers' Memorial Day, and also a Day of Action globally on coronavirus. Seb, do you want to say a few last words?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the breadth of this discussion just does kind of show how deep concepts of debt and things like that reach into every part of our global and individual existences. You know, when we can talk about you know, international relations and colonialism, while at the same time sort of you know, somebody's universal credit obligations or incomes or whatever, and we're still having the same conversation, really shows that the level of you know, penetration and importance of debt as a topic into everything when we're talking about it. And yeah, that's because it's a way of conceiving of our social obligations and future worth and all kinds of important concepts that are meaningful to us as human beings and vital in terms of economic structures. And so ways that we can, you know, take real control over that, like with actual, you know, local credit unions, for instance, is bringing the question of like community worth, social worth, much closer to home and much more accessible to people. And then you can have arguments around, you know, lending for profit at all as a concept rather than lending to help the local community, things like that. So there's a lot of ways it can go, and we should, yeah, be working to try and address these problems that inevitably are going to be arising in our local communities around, you know, sort of how do we keep the local brewery, the local pub in a state of existence without just simply loading it with more debt, or at commercial debts at least, what can be done locally to try and change that and change people's thinkings around debt. Is it legitimate, and what alternatives we can do would be very important. Yeah, thank you.
Right, well, thanks very much everybody for a great discussion.